The movie opens by introducing Hutch Mansell, a quiet, mild-mannered family man whose uneventful life is about to take a violent turn. Everything begins with what looks like a relatively ordinary home invasion. Two small-time criminals break into his house, but instead of stopping them, Hutch allows them to leave. That single decision causes the people around him to see him differently. What nobody realizes, however, is that Hutch is far more dangerous than he appears. Before long, the incident pushes him toward a confrontation that eventually places him directly in the path of a ruthless Russian crime boss. How does an apparently harmless suburban father end up trapped in a war with organized criminals? That is where the story of Nobody begins. Hutch lives a seemingly average suburban life with his wife, Becca, and their two children, Blake and Sammy. From the outside, there is nothing particularly remarkable about him. He works an uninspiring office job at a metal fabrication business owned by Becca's father, Eddie, and his days seem to repeat themselves with almost mechanical predictability. His home life is not much better. The closeness he once shared with Becca has faded, and there is an obvious emotional distance between them. At work, Hutch appears equally dissatisfied. He goes through his routine without enthusiasm, while quietly trying to arrange the purchase of Eddie's company. Then, late one night, that monotonous existence is suddenly interrupted. Hutch wakes to discover that two intruders have entered the family's home. One is a man and the other a woman, and both appear to be armed. Hutch manages to get into a position where he could potentially overpower them, yet something unexpected happens. Rather than attack, he hesitates. The burglars demand money, and Hutch allows them to take the limited cash they can find. Things become more tense when Blake unexpectedly gets involved. Hutch's teenage son manages to jump one of the intruders and temporarily gains the advantage. For a moment, it appears that Hutch might finally step in and take control of the situation. Instead, he tells Blake to release the burglar. Blake is confused, but he follows his father's order. As the thieves prepare to escape, one of them strikes Blake in the face before running from the house. Hutch watches them leave without retaliating. By the following morning, the emotional damage from the burglary is obvious. Blake cannot understand why his father refused to fight back, while Becca seems equally troubled by Hutch's behavior. To them, he had a chance to protect the family and chose not to take it. Hutch's reaction makes him appear frightened, passive, and incapable of defending the people closest to him. Unfortunately for Hutch, the story does not remain inside the house for long. News about the robbery spreads through the neighborhood and eventually reaches his workplace. People begin making comments about what happened. Some joke about Hutch's failure to confront the burglars, while others openly criticize him for allowing the criminals to escape after Blake had already managed to overpower one of them. The humiliation begins piling up. Even Charlie, Hutch's brother-in-law, seems bothered by how Hutch handled the situation. Convinced that Hutch needs to be better prepared if something similar happens again, Charlie gives him a handgun and suggests keeping it around for protection. Hutch accepts it, but his reaction remains difficult to read. At work, he later meets Eddie to continue discussing his interest in buying the metal fabrication company. Hutch has apparently made an offer, but Eddie is unimpressed with the amount. He tells Hutch that if he truly wants the business, he will need to return with a figure that makes considerably more sense. With pressure mounting at home and ridicule following him at work, Hutch eventually retreats to the privacy of his office. Hidden there is a radio that he uses to secretly contact his adoptive brother, Harry. Their conversation reveals that Hutch's decision during the burglary was not simply the result of fear. He explains what happened the previous night and tells Harry that he made a conscious choice not to attack the intruders. Hutch had studied them during the confrontation and quickly realized that they were not experienced criminals. Several details had stood out to him. They barely took anything valuable. Instead of searching aggressively for jewelry or expensive possessions, they grabbed only a small amount of available cash and loose change. More importantly, Hutch noticed that the gun they were using was not loaded. From those clues, he concluded that the pair were probably desperate rather than genuinely violent. In Hutch's mind, they seemed like people driven into robbery because of financial trouble or some urgent personal crisis. That was why he let them go. He believed hurting or killing them would have been unnecessary. After finishing work, Hutch visits his elderly father, David, who now lives in a nursing home. Their interaction seems casual, but there is a subtle sense that Hutch's father knows more about him than the ordinary suburban world does. Later, Hutch returns home. Before entering, he pauses outside and looks through the window at his family. For a moment, he simply watches Becca, Blake, and Sammy from a distance. When he finally walks inside and greets them, the tension from the burglary still hangs in the room. Becca barely acknowledges him, and Blake remains cold toward his father. Neither has forgotten what happened. Sammy, however, approaches Hutch with a much simpler concern. She tells him that she cannot find her little kitty cat bracelet. She believes it may have disappeared during the robbery. That small detail changes Hutch immediately. Until this moment, he had accepted the insults, disappointment, and embarrassment without reacting. He had even defended the burglars' motives to Harry, but the thought that they may have stolen something important from his young daughter finally gives him a reason to act. Hutch leaves the house without explaining much. He heads back to the nursing home and visits his father again. This time, however, he is not there simply to talk. Hutch borrows David's old handgun and begins searching for the two burglars. The only useful clue he has is something he noticed during the home invasion, a distinctive tattoo on the wrist of one of the thieves. Hutch sketches the tattoo from memory and starts visiting tattoo shops around the city, hoping somebody will recognize the design. Eventually, he enters one particular tattoo parlor filled with intimidating-looking customers. At first, the men inside seem amused by him. Standing there in his ordinary clothes and suburban appearance, Hutch does not exactly look like someone who belongs in their world. A few people watch him with obvious contempt, assuming he is harmless. Then one of the men notices Hutch more carefully. His expression changes. Instead of mocking him, the man approaches Hutch and quietly shows him respect, even thanking him. The atmosphere inside the shop immediately shifts. The other customers realize that Hutch may not be the insignificant office worker they initially assumed him to be. Their joking disappears, and the room becomes noticeably more cautious around him. With help from the information he gathers there, Hutch finally manages to locate the burglar's address. He goes directly to their apartment. Once inside, Hutch confronts the couple and demands the return of Sammy's missing bracelet. His calm suburban personality is gone. He threatens them and makes it clear that he is no longer willing to simply walk away. The frightened couple insists that they do not have the bracelet. Hutch continues pressing them, convinced they must have taken it. Then he hears something from another room, a baby crying. Hutch looks over and realizes there is a sick infant inside the apartment. Suddenly, the entire situation becomes clearer. His original judgment about the couple had been correct. These were not hardened criminals, living comfortably from what they stole. They were desperate parents struggling with a seriously ill child and apparently doing whatever they could to survive. Hutch's anger disappears almost immediately. Realizing what he has just done, he lowers his weapon and leaves the apartment without hurting them. But instead of feeling relieved, Hutch is furious with himself. Outside, the frustration that has been building inside him finally starts breaking through. He slams his fist against a wall, angry that he allowed himself to storm into the home of desperate parents over a bracelet they apparently never stole. He walks away carrying something far heavier than disappointment. The confrontation has awakened a part of Hutch that he has been suppressing for a very long time, and now that side of him is beginning to come back. On his way home, Hutch boards a city bus, still carrying the frustration from everything that has happened. He is angry with himself, disappointed by how the confrontation with the burglars ended, and clearly looking for some kind of release. That opportunity arrives when a group of loud, intoxicated men gets onto the bus. The men immediately begin causing trouble, disturbing the other passengers, and acting aggressively toward anyone nearby. Hutch watches them for a moment, almost as though he is waiting to see how far they will go. Then their attention turns toward a young woman traveling alone. The group surrounds her, making threatening comments, and behaving in a way that makes their intentions obvious. For Hutch, that is enough. He calmly asks the bus driver to open the door and leave. Once the driver steps away, Hutch turns back toward the drunken men. This time, he does not hold himself back. A brutal fight breaks out inside the bus. Hutch attacks the group one by one, taking several heavy blows himself while systematically beating the men down. The fight is rough, chaotic, and far more violent than anything his quiet suburban appearance would suggest he is capable of. What initially looks like Hutch defending the young woman quickly becomes something more personal. He is releasing every bit of frustration that has been building inside him. By the time the fight ends, the bus is badly damaged. The attackers are lying injured across the seats and floor, and Hutch himself is bruised, bleeding, and exhausted. When he finally returns home, Becca immediately notices his condition. Instead of questioning him aggressively, she helps clean his wounds and treats the cuts and bruises covering his body. For the first time in a while, there is a sense of genuine closeness between them. Becca stays beside him, caring for him until he eventually falls asleep. The moment forces Hutch to recognize just how disconnected he has become from the people closest to him. Since the burglary, communication inside the Mansell household has nearly disappeared. Hutch realizes that instead of bringing his family closer, the incident has created even more distance between them. He decides that he needs to rebuild that connection. But while Hutch is beginning to repair his personal life, somewhere else another dangerous story is unfolding. The movie introduces Yulian Kuznetsov, a powerful Russian crime boss. Yulian is shown enjoying himself inside an extravagant nightclub, surrounded by music, alcohol, and members of the criminal organization he controls. His real business, however, extends far beyond the nightclub. Yulian manages a large money laundering operation for the Russian underworld. Other criminals place enormous amounts of illegal cash in his hands, trusting him to hide, move, and clean the money without attracting attention from law enforcement. That responsibility gives him enormous influence, but not everyone working with him completely trusts him. Some of his criminal associates begin questioning whether Yulian is reliable enough to continue handling their money. Rather than discussing those concerns privately, they confront him directly. Yulian responds in the most extreme way possible. He grabs an unsuspecting man from inside the club and suddenly kills him in front of everyone. The act has almost nothing to do with the victim himself. It is a message. Yulian wants every person in the room to understand exactly what happens to anyone who challenges his authority. His associates immediately get the point. Soon afterward, however, Yulian receives news that completely changes his mood. His younger brother, Teddy, has been hospitalized. Teddy is badly injured and unconscious after being beaten almost to death. Yulian immediately travels to the hospital with his men. There, he learns that Teddy was one of the drunken passengers involved in the fight on Hutch's bus. The quiet suburban father who had been trying to release his frustration had unknowingly beaten the younger brother of one of the most dangerous criminals in the city. Yulian begins questioning Teddy's surviving friends, demanding to know who attacked them. Most of them know almost nothing about Hutch. However, during the fight, one of the men managed to take something useful from him, Hutch's business card. The thug hands it over to Yulian. Now the crime boss has a name, Hutch Mansell. The following morning, Hutch appears surprisingly relaxed. He is sitting at the breakfast table with Becca and the children, enjoying what feels like one of the first normal family moments they have shared in quite some time. Then Hutch receives a call from Harry. His brother already knows about the bus fight. More importantly, Harry knows exactly who Hutch put in the hospital. He warns Hutch that one of the men he nearly killed is Teddy Kuznetsov, the younger brother of Yulian Kuznetsov. That name changes the situation completely. Harry urges Hutch to speak with someone known as the Barber, a man with deep knowledge of the criminal underworld who may be able to explain exactly what Hutch is now dealing with. Hutch follows the advice. He finds the Barber and asks about Yulian. What he learns confirms that this is not an ordinary criminal. Yulian is deeply connected to Russian organized crime and is responsible for protecting and laundering enormous amounts of mob money. He is violent, unpredictable, heavily protected, and feared by many of the people who work with him. Hutch listens carefully. Still, he does not appear particularly frightened. More importantly, he does not regret what he did on the bus. As far as Hutch is concerned, Teddy and his friends chose to terrorize innocent passengers, and he made them pay for it. If consequences are coming, Hutch seems prepared to accept them. Meanwhile, Yulian is carrying out his own investigation. Using only Hutch's business card, he hires a skilled female investigator to uncover everything she can about the man who attacked Teddy. At first, Hutch appears completely unremarkable. He has a family, an ordinary home, and an office job. But when the investigator digs deeper, she discovers information that completely changes her understanding of him. Hutch has a hidden history. Records connected to his past reveal that he was involved in extremely dangerous operations and developed a reputation for completing assignments with terrifying efficiency. The information suggests that Hutch was not simply competent, he was exceptionally lethal. According to the files she uncovers, he rarely failed and had a reputation for eliminating targets with ruthless precision. The investigator immediately realizes that Yulian is not dealing with some random middle-aged office employee. After passing the information along, she makes one thing very clear. She wants nothing more to do with the situation. Whatever payment Yulian might offer is not worth becoming involved with Hutch Mansell. Her priority is staying alive. Yulian ignores the warning. That same night, he decides to retaliate. He sends a team of armed men to Hutch's house, placing the operation under the command of his trusted lieutenant, Pavel. Their mission is simple, capture Hutch, but Hutch senses the danger before the attackers enter. Realizing that armed men are approaching the house, he immediately moves Becca and the children into the basement. He tells them to remain quiet no matter what they hear. More importantly, he specifically warns them not to call the police. Becca does not fully understand what is happening, but Hutch's tone makes it obvious that this is no ordinary home invasion. Then Julian's men storm the house. The moment they enter, Hutch changes completely. The passive husband and exhausted office worker disappear. In their place is the trained killer hinted at by his mysterious past. Hutch moves through the house using anything available to gain an advantage. One attacker after another is taken down. The fighting is fast, violent, and extremely close range. Furniture is destroyed, walls are damaged, and bodies begin accumulating throughout the house. Julian's men clearly expected an easy target. Instead, they have walked directly into a trap. Hutch kills or incapacitates most of the attackers. However, Pavel manages to catch him from behind. Using an electrical weapon, Pavel shocks Hutch repeatedly until he finally loses consciousness. With Hutch incapacitated, the surviving men restrain him and load him into a vehicle. For a moment, it appears that Julian's plan has succeeded, but Hutch does not stay unconscious for long. He wakes up while being transported and immediately begins working on the restraints around his wrists. Eventually, he manages to free his hands. Searching through the confined space around him, Hutch notices a fire extinguisher. He quickly turns it into a weapon. Hutch releases the extinguisher inside the vehicle, filling the driver's area and blocking visibility. The driver loses control. The vehicle crashes violently. Pavel and the remaining members of the crew are killed in the wreck. Hutch survives. After escaping, he immediately makes his way back home. When he reaches the house, he returns to the basement and finally lets his family out. Becca and the children walk upstairs and see the aftermath for themselves. The home has been completely destroyed. Furniture is overturned, walls are damaged, and the bodies of Julian's men are scattered through the rooms. For Becca, the situation raises terrifying questions. Her husband, whom she had recently believed incapable of defending the family, has somehow slaughtered an entire team of armed attackers. Hutch knows there is no longer any way to hide the truth, but there is also no time to explain everything. He tells Becca that she needs to take the children somewhere safe. He assures her that he will deal with the people responsible and promises to bring the situation under control as quickly as he can. For now, his only concern is getting his family away from the danger surrounding him. Once Becca and the children are gone, Hutch begins preparing for what comes next. He gathers important possessions that have been hidden away for years. Among them are several bars of gold. The gold is not ordinary family savings. It is payment Hutch received for work he performed during his former life, another indication that his quiet suburban existence has always been hiding something much darker. After removing everything he needs, Hutch makes a final decision about the house. He burns it. By setting the property on fire, Hutch destroys much of the evidence left behind from the attack and wipes away the life he had been pretending to live. The ordinary home, the predictable routine, and the harmless version of Hutch Mansell are effectively gone. But Julian's retaliation has extended even further than Hutch realizes. His men were not sent only after Hutch. Knowing that family can be used as leverage, Julian also targets Hutch's father. While Hutch is dealing with the attack on his own house, two of Julian's most capable killers are sent to the nursing home where David lives. Their assignment is straightforward: kill Hutch's father. What Julian does not yet understand, however, is that David Mansell may not be quite as helpless as an elderly man living in a nursing facility appears. But Julian has seriously underestimated Hutch's family. The two assassins sent to the nursing home expect David to be an easy target. After all, he is an elderly man living quietly in assisted care, and nothing about him suggests he could pose a threat. That assumption lasts only a few moments. David quickly turns the tables on them and takes both men down with surprising ease, revealing that Hutch is not the only member of the Mansell family with a dangerous past. Meanwhile, Hutch moves on to the next stage of his plan. He visits Eddie and finally completes the purchase of the metal fabrication company. This time, instead of negotiating over numbers, Hutch uses the gold bars he has been keeping from his former life as payment. Charlie sees what is happening and believes Hutch is disrespecting or humiliating the family. Angry, he tries to confront him physically. That proves to be a mistake. Hutch disables Charlie almost immediately, making it obvious that he is no longer interested in pretending to be the harmless man everyone thought they knew. By now, Julian has also learned what happened to Pavel and the rest of the crew sent to capture Hutch. Nearly all of them are dead. The news sends Julian into a rage. He orders every available man in his organization to find Hutch and kill him. At this point, there is no possibility of quietly ending the conflict. Julian has already targeted Hutch's wife, children, and father, and Hutch understands that the only way to protect his family permanently is to destroy the threat at its source. So he begins preparing for a full-scale confrontation. Hutch knows exactly where Yulian is vulnerable. The Russian crime boss may be feared because of his violence, but the real foundation of his power is the enormous amount of money he controls on behalf of other criminals. That money does not actually belong to Yulian. It belongs to powerful figures in the Russian mob, and Yulian's job is to keep it protected. Hutch decides to hit him there. He tracks down the location where Yulian stores the cash entrusted to him by the organization. The facility is heavily guarded, but that does not stop Hutch. He enters, eliminates the men protecting the place, and reaches the money. Then he destroys it. Hutch sets fire to the massive reserve of criminal cash, wiping out the fortune Yulian had been responsible for safeguarding. And he does not stop with the money. Yulian's valuable art collection is burned as well. Within minutes, Hutch has done far more damage than simply killing a few gangsters. He has attacked Yulian's reputation, his business, and his standing with the Russian mob. Losing his own money would have been bad enough. Losing everyone else's money could get Yulian killed. After destroying the cash, Hutch does something even more reckless. He goes directly to Yulian's nightclub. Alone, Hutch walks into the heart of the criminal organization carrying a claymore mine, making it clear that any sudden move could turn the entire room into a disaster. Yulian is furious, but Hutch remains completely calm. With the explosive threat in front of them, Yulian orders his people to clear the area and eventually sits across from Hutch. Now Hutch offers him a way out. He tells Yulian that the conflict can end right there. Hutch is willing to walk away and leave him alive on one condition. Yulian must stop coming after him and must never threaten his family again. Then Hutch reveals exactly what he has just done. He tells Yulian that the mob's money is gone. The cash that countless dangerous people trusted Yulian to protect has been burned. In other words, even if Yulian survives his conflict with Hutch, he now has a much bigger problem waiting for him. Hutch even suggests that Yulian should disappear, start over somewhere else, and choose a profession that is considerably safer than organized crime. Then, as calmly as he arrived, Hutch leaves the nightclub with the claymore and returns to his car. For a brief moment, Yulian has a choice. He could accept the offer and survive, but pride, anger, and loyalty to his brother make that impossible. Teddy is lying critically injured because of Hutch, and Yulian refuses to let the man responsible simply walk away. The moment Hutch leaves, Yulian orders every remaining member of his organization to pursue him. The chase leads them directly to the metal fabrication plant Hutch has just purchased. What Yulian does not know is that Hutch chose this location very deliberately. The factory has been transformed into a battlefield. Hutch has spent time preparing traps, weapons, and defensive positions throughout the building, turning an ordinary industrial facility into an environment designed to kill anyone who enters. Yulian's men arrive in force. And Hutch is waiting. Then two unexpected allies join him. David appears first. The elderly man from the nursing home is revealed to be a retired FBI agent who, during his active years, was apparently every bit as formidable as his son. Harry arrives as well. Hutch's adoptive brother is a highly trained former soldier, and unlike Hutch's suburban family, he already understands exactly what kind of man Hutch really is. Now the three of them fight together. Yulian's gang pours into the factory, only to discover that nearly every section of the building has been rigged against them. Hutch uses traps and improvised weapons to thin their numbers. David moves through the facility with the confidence of someone who has spent decades around firearms and violent situations. Harry does the same, attacking Yulian's men with military precision. The factory becomes complete chaos. Gunfire erupts from every direction. Explosions tear through different sections of the building. Gangsters are caught in traps before they can even reach Hutch. One group after another is eliminated. Although Harry takes a bullet to the shoulder during the battle, the wound does not stop him from continuing to fight. Eventually, the three men manage to wipe out nearly Yulian's entire force. When the shooting finally slows, only Yulian remains. Hutch is almost out of ammunition. Instead of searching for another firearm, he decides to end things in a much more dramatic way. He takes the claymore mine he has been carrying and attaches it to a piece of bullet-resistant glass. Using the glass as a shield, Hutch charges directly toward Yulian. Yulian fires at him, but the bullets cannot penetrate the barrier. Hutch closes the distance, then he detonates the claymore. The explosion kills Yulian instantly. The war is finally over. Hutch checks that David and Harry have managed to get away from the scene before he makes one final decision. He stays behind. When the police arrive, Hutch does not attempt to escape. He allows himself to be arrested. Later, he is placed in an interrogation room with two investigators, one male and one female. Both are struggling to understand what they have just found. The factory is filled with dead criminals. The destruction is enormous, and the number of bodies makes the entire scene look more like the aftermath of a military assault than an ordinary crime. And Hutch, apparently the only man left behind, calmly claims responsibility. The investigators can barely believe him. This ordinary-looking middle-aged family man is telling them that he personally helped wipe out an entire criminal organization. Then something unusual happens. Both investigators receive phone calls almost simultaneously. They answer. Whatever they hear on the other end completely changes their behavior. Their expressions shift from suspicion to confusion and then to disbelief. Suddenly, Hutch is no longer treated like an ordinary murder suspect. Not long afterward, he is released. No charges are filed. Before allowing him to leave, the investigators ask the obvious question that has been hanging over the entire story. Who exactly is Hutch Mansell? Hutch gives them the simplest answer possible. He tells them that he is nobody. But by this point, the audience finally understands what that answer really means. Hutch was never an ordinary office worker. In his former life, he worked as what was known as an auditor, a highly specialized operative used by intelligence agencies when certain problems needed to disappear. He was essentially a government-sanctioned assassin. When Hutch was sent after someone, that person was not expected to survive. His reputation came from being the final person an organization ever wanted showing up at its door. He completed assignments efficiently, rarely failed, and became known for being extraordinarily dangerous. But one mission changed him. During that assignment, Hutch was supposed to eliminate a target. Instead, he chose to let the man live. That decision stayed with him. About a year later, Hutch tracked the former target down and discovered something unexpected. The man had completely transformed his life. He had left his past behind, built a family, and was living peacefully with people he loved. Hutch saw something in that life that he had never allowed himself to have. For years, violence, missions, and obedience had defined his existence. But watching someone else escape that world made Hutch realize that he wanted the same thing: a wife, children, a home, a normal routine. So Hutch made a decision that his superiors did not particularly appreciate. He retired. He walked away from the work, buried his violent identity, and attempted to become an ordinary husband and father. For years, that life mostly worked. But the burglary, the bus fight, and Yulian's retaliation dragged the old Hutch back to the surface. 3 months after the battle with Yulian, Hutch and Becca appear to have rebuilt their relationship. They are looking at a new house together, preparing to start over after everything that happened. The couple tour the property, discussing whether it could become their next home. For the first time in a long while, Hutch again appears to have the peaceful family life he originally wanted. Then a phone rings. The call is mysterious, but the implication is obvious. Someone from Hutch's old world has found him, and apparently his particular set of skills is needed once again. The movie leaves Hutch's future uncertain. He may have defeated Yulian and protected his family, but escaping his previous life permanently could be much more difficult. The story adds one final tease during the mid-credits sequence. David and Harry are shown traveling together in an RV toward an unknown destination. At first, it looks almost like an ordinary road trip. Then the contents of the vehicle are revealed. The RV is packed with weapons. Clearly, whatever the Mansell family is doing next, retirement may not be part of the plan. And that is where nobody leaves Hutch's story. A man who spent years pretending to be harmless is forced to reveal that underneath the repetitive job, strained marriage, and quiet suburban routine is someone extremely dangerous. The film also builds its central conflict around two men whose loyalty to family drives nearly everything they do. Hutch's violence begins escalating after his family is threatened, while Yulian's entire campaign against Hutch is driven by what happened to Teddy. Neither man is willing to ignore an attack on someone he loves. The difference is that each act of retaliation pushes the conflict further until there is no peaceful way back. What begins with Hutch taking out his frustration on a group of violent men aboard a bus eventually grows into a war involving assassins, organized crime, destroyed fortunes, and an entire factory turned into a battlefield. By the end, Hutch may still call himself nobody, but after everything we have seen, that is probably the least accurate. When you first hear that Bob Odenkirk is leading an action movie, your immediate reaction is probably the same as mine was. Wait, Bob Odenkirk, the guy from Better Call Saul. Because for years, Odenkirk built his reputation around something completely different. He was known for sharp dialogue, awkward charm, dark comedy, and characters who could talk their way out of trouble rather than punch their way through it. Even as Jimmy McGill, He was never the kind of character you expected to see throwing himself into brutal fight scenes. And that is exactly why Nobody works as an interesting experiment right from the beginning. The movie understands that Bob Odenkirk does not look like a traditional action hero. He doesn't have the typical larger-than-life presence. He isn't introduced as someone who walks into a room and immediately makes everyone nervous. Instead, Hutch Mansell looks like a guy you would completely ignore, a regular husband, a tired father, someone stuck in the routine of everyday life, and the film uses that image very carefully. There is something genuinely entertaining about watching an actor who has spent years playing intelligent, slightly uncomfortable, ordinary people suddenly step into a completely different genre. The surprise is not just that Odenkirk can handle the action, it's that he doesn't try to imitate the usual action stars. He brings his own personality into the role. Hutch isn't played like a superhero. He doesn't have that effortless confidence where everything goes perfectly. There is hesitation, frustration, and even a sense that he is uncomfortable with the person he is becoming. That makes the transformation more interesting, because the movie isn't asking you to believe Bob Odenkirk suddenly became some unstoppable machine. It is asking you to believe that maybe this ordinary-looking man was never ordinary at all. A lot of action movies depend on making their heroes look dangerous from the first scene. Nobody does the opposite. It builds its entire appeal around the idea that the person everyone overlooks might actually be the most dangerous person in the room. And honestly, casting Odenkirk was the smartest decision the movie made. If they had put a typical action star in this role, the mystery would disappear immediately. You would already know what kind of movie you were watching. But with Bob Odenkirk, there is always that question hanging over every scene. How far is this normal guy actually willing to go? That curiosity carries the entire film. It turns what could have been a familiar revenge story into something with a little more personality, because the biggest surprise isn't just what Hutch does, it's seeing Bob Odenkirk become the person doing it. At first glance, Hutch Mansell seems like the kind of person nobody would notice, and that is actually the entire point of the character. He wakes up, goes to work, comes home, repeats the same routine every day. There is nothing about his life that suggests excitement or danger. He is not presented as a secret genius or someone secretly waiting for his moment. He just looks tired, ordinary, almost invisible. And the movie spends a surprising amount of time showing that side of him. We see the small details of Hutch's life, the repeated habits, the quiet frustration, the feeling that he has become background noise even inside his own home. His family isn't exactly cruel to him, but there is clearly a distance there. His son sees him as someone who failed to protect them, and his wife seems emotionally disconnected from the man he has become. The interesting thing is that Hutch's biggest problem isn't that he is powerless, it is that he has chosen to live as if he is. The home invasion is what breaks that balance. When criminals enter his house, everyone expects Hutch to react differently. His son steps up, but Hutch holds back. In that moment, people around him see weakness. They see someone who froze when his family needed him, but the movie slowly reveals that Hutch didn't freeze because he was incapable. He froze because he was trying to stay away from something buried deep inside him. That is where the character becomes much more interesting. A lot of movies follow the familiar idea of an average person discovering they have strength they never knew existed. Nobody takes a slightly different approach. Hutch already knows exactly what he is capable of. The problem is that he has spent years trying not to become that person again. There is a constant tension between the life he built and the person he used to be. He wants the quiet family life. He wants to be the normal husband and father. But there is also this frustration building underneath, years of being ignored, underestimated, and pushed aside. When that anger finally comes out, it is not just about revenge. It feels like a pressure valve opening. What makes Hutch work as a character is that the movie doesn't turn him into a flawless action machine. He gets hurt. He struggles. He takes damage. There are moments where you can almost feel the exhaustion behind every punch and every fight. He is dangerous, but he is not invincible. That makes the violence more satisfying because it feels like Hutch is fighting against his own limits as much as he is fighting his enemies. Of course, the idea of a quiet family man secretly having an extremely violent past is not exactly new. We've seen versions of this story many times before, but the reason Hutch remains interesting is because of the contrast. Seeing someone who looks completely harmless suddenly reveal another side creates a strange mix of surprise and sympathy. You understand why he wants to protect his family. But you also understand that a part of him has been waiting for an excuse to stop pretending. And that is really the heart of Nobody. It is not just about a man beating up bad guys. It is about a person who spent years hiding parts of himself, only to realize that those parts never truly disappeared. They were just waiting for the right moment to come back. One of the most interesting things about Nobody is that, on paper, the story is actually very simple. There isn't a complicated mystery to solve or a massive emotional journey filled with twists and turns. The basic idea is something we've seen before. An ordinary person has a hidden past, something pushes him too far, and suddenly everyone realizes they underestimated the wrong person. But what makes the movie work is not necessarily the originality of the story. It is the way the film slowly reveals that story. For a good portion of the beginning, Nobody almost tricks you into thinking it is going to be a different kind of movie. It spends time inside Hutch's boring routine, showing the repetition of his daily life and how invisible he has become. The film takes its time before revealing what kind of person he really is. That slow build is important because the movie wants you to experience Hutch the same way everyone else does. At first, you see him as just another ordinary guy, someone who gets overlooked, someone who doesn't seem capable of much. Then little by little, the screenplay starts pulling back the curtain, and that gradual reveal is probably the strongest part of the writing. Instead of immediately explaining everything about Hutch's past, the movie lets questions build naturally. Why does he react this way? Why does he avoid violence? Why does he seem strangely familiar with dangerous situations? The answers come piece by piece, and that mystery keeps the first half of the film engaging. Where the screenplay becomes less surprising is when the full action formula begins to take over. Once Hutch's past comes into focus, the story moves into more familiar territory. A criminal organization wants revenge. The hero has to fight through waves of enemies, and the conflict keeps escalating until it reaches a huge final confrontation. It is a structure that action fans have seen many times before, and to be fair, the movie knows exactly what it is doing. Nobody is not trying to reinvent the revenge thriller. It is taking a familiar setup and trying to make it entertaining through character, style, and energy. That works for a lot of the runtime. The screenplay keeps things moving. It doesn't waste too much time explaining every detail or building unnecessary subplots. The story is focused on Hutch, his choices, and the consequences that follow. For an action movie with a short runtime, that efficiency helps. But there are moments where the simplicity becomes a weakness. Some characters are clearly there just to move the plot forward. The villains are more like obstacles than fully developed people, and certain events happen because the movie needs the next action sequence to begin. If you stop and analyze every decision too closely, some parts don't hold together perfectly. There is also a debate about how much depth the story actually needs. A movie like this could have gone much darker and explored Hutch's past in a more serious way, almost like a psychological character study. But that probably would have changed the entire identity of the film. Nobody is not interested in becoming a slow, complicated drama. It wants to be a stylish, violent, entertaining action ride with just enough character work to make you care. And that balance is where the screenplay succeeds. It understands that the audience is not here because they need a completely new story. They are here because they want to see this specific character pushed to the edge and discover what happens when he finally stops holding back. So while the narrative itself may not be groundbreaking, the way the movie packages that familiar idea gives it enough personality to stand on its own. The story might feel familiar, but the character at the center makes you want to keep watching. The biggest reason people are going to remember Nobody is simple: the action. This movie does not waste time trying to convince you that Hutch is dangerous through endless speeches or dramatic introductions. Instead, it lets the fights do the talking, and when Hutch finally breaks, the film completely changes gears. The first major action sequence, especially the famous bus fight, is where Nobody really announces what kind of movie it wants to be. It starts in a surprisingly grounded way. Hutch is not walking into the scene like an unstoppable superhero. He is angry, frustrated, and clearly out of practice. He gets hit, he struggles, he makes mistakes. That is what makes the sequence work. A lot of action movies have characters who look almost untouchable. They move perfectly, avoid every bullet, and somehow walk away without a scratch. Hutch feels different. He is skilled, but he is also human. Every punch looks like it hurts. Every impact has weight. You can almost feel how exhausting the fight is for him. The choreography has a really nice balance between realism and style. The movie definitely operates in an exaggerated world, but the fights are filmed in a way that keeps them readable. You can actually understand what is happening. The camera isn't constantly shaking around to hide the action, and the editing doesn't cut so quickly that you lose track of the movement. That makes a huge difference. When Hutch fights, you are watching the performance, not just the effects. Bob Odenkirk's physical preparation becomes a big part of the experience because the movie allows you to see him doing the work. The longer shots and physical choreography give the impression that this is actually the actor on screen, not just a replacement doing everything for him. As the movie continues, the action keeps getting bigger. The fights move from personal confrontations into full-scale battles involving guns, explosions, and increasingly ridiculous situations. Eventually, nobody stops pretending it is a realistic thriller and fully embraces its comic book energy. And honestly, that is where some viewers will either love it or lose interest. If you are looking for grounded action, the later parts might push things too far. The number of enemies, the survival odds, and the sheer amount of chaos become impossible to take seriously. But the movie understands that. It is not asking you to believe every moment. It is asking you to enjoy the ride. The action works because it has personality. There is a dark sense of humor running through the violence. The movie knows how absurd some of these situations are, and instead of hiding that, it leans into it. The brutality becomes part of the entertainment rather than something purely serious. Of course, this style of action is not exactly new. After years of movies built around unstoppable fighters, secret assassins, and endless waves of enemies, some of these ideas can feel familiar. The structure is something audiences have seen before. But nobody gets a major advantage from its lead character. Watching Bob Odenkirk, someone audiences associate with talking his way out of problems, suddenly delivering brutal action scenes creates a different energy. The choreography might borrow from familiar territory, but the person performing it makes it feel fresh. By the final act, the movie has completely embraced its own ridiculousness. It becomes louder, bigger, and more exaggerated than where it started. Whether that works for you depends on what you want from the film. If you want a serious, realistic action thriller, this probably goes too far. But if you want a stylish, violent, darkly funny action movie, where every fight feels like a release of years of frustration, Nobody delivers exactly that. The entire idea behind Nobody could have easily failed if Bob Odenkirk wasn't fully committed to it. On paper, the casting sounds almost like a joke. The guy known for playing Saul Goodman, a character who survives through intelligence, manipulation, and conversation, suddenly becomes the center of a violent action movie, but somehow it works. The reason it works is because Odenkirk doesn't try to become a typical action hero. He doesn't suddenly transform into someone with the confidence and swagger of a traditional movie badass. Instead, he keeps the qualities that made him interesting as an actor in the first place. Hutch is awkward. He is quiet. He looks like someone who would avoid confrontation rather than start one. And Odenkirk completely understands that this is the reason the character is interesting. The performance is built around contrast. Early in the movie, Odenkirk sells Hutch as a man who has disappeared into his own routine. You can feel the frustration behind his eyes. He is someone who has spent years convincing himself that a normal life is enough, even though part of him clearly misses who he used to be. Then when that other side finally appears, Odenkirk doesn't play it like a completely different person. That is the important part. He doesn't suddenly become a loud, arrogant action star. Hutch is still Hutch. He is still controlled, still uncomfortable, still carrying that same quiet personality. The difference is that now we see what was underneath all along. And honestly, that is what makes his action scenes more convincing. If a traditional action actor played this role, the surprise would disappear. We would already expect them to win every fight. But with Odenkirk, there is always this feeling of watching someone prove himself. You believe that Hutch can fight, but you also believe that every fight is difficult for him. The physical transformation deserves a lot of credit as well. Odenkirk clearly committed himself to making the action believable. The training shows not because he suddenly looks like a superhero, but because his movements feel deliberate. He looks like someone who has experience, someone who knows what he is doing, but he also looks like someone who can actually get hurt. That balance is what separates the performance from a simple gimmick. The movie could have treated the whole thing as a joke. Look, the comedy guy is beating people up. Thankfully, it doesn't. Odenkirk plays Hutch with complete seriousness. He understands the absurdity of the situation, but he never mocks the character. That commitment is what allows the audience to invest in him. There is also something strangely satisfying about seeing an actor with such a familiar personality step into a completely unexpected genre. It is not just about watching Bob Odenkirk perform action scenes. It is about seeing an actor expand what audiences think he is capable of. By the end, the biggest surprise of Nobody is not the violence, the villains, or even the action sequences. It is the fact that Bob Odenkirk makes you believe he was always capable of being this guy. The movie simply gave him the opportunity to show it. While Bob Odenkirk is obviously the main reason Nobody works, the supporting cast gives the movie a lot of its personality. The film could have easily become a one-man show where everything revolves around Hutch, but the characters around him add extra energy, especially when the story starts expanding beyond a simple home invasion. The biggest surprise is Christopher Lloyd. Seeing Lloyd in this kind of role is honestly one of the movie's most enjoyable choices. He is not just there as a familiar face or a nostalgic appearance. The film actually gives him a chance to have fun. His character brings a completely different energy to the movie, especially because you are not expecting someone like Christopher Lloyd to suddenly become part of the action. There is something naturally funny about the contrast. You have this quiet, underestimated family man, and then suddenly his older father enters the picture with a completely unexpected attitude toward violence. The movie understands why that is entertaining and doesn't overexplain it. It just lets Lloyd enjoy the moment, and he clearly does. His expressions, his timing, and the way he approaches the character add a lot of charm. In a movie that becomes increasingly exaggerated, Lloyd fits perfectly into that heightened world. Aleksey Serebryakov, meanwhile, plays Yulian Kuznetsov, the Russian crime boss who becomes Hutch's main opponent. He is not exactly the most original villain we have seen in this genre, but Serebryakov makes the role more interesting through his performance. Instead of playing him as just a serious, emotionless gangster, he brings a strange unpredictability to the character. There is a theatrical quality to him that matches the movie's increasingly wild tone. He feels less like a realistic criminal figure and more like someone pulled from a dark comic book. That works for this type of film. The character itself may not have the deepest development, but as an obstacle for Hutch, he does the job. You understand why he is dangerous, even if the movie spends more time exploring Hutch than the villain. RZA also adds another layer to Hutch's past as his brother Harry. His role is smaller, but his presence helps expand the world around Hutch. He gives the audience a glimpse into the life Hutch left behind and suggests that there is more history there than the movie fully explores. Connie Nielsen as Becca, Hutch's wife, brings a quieter presence. Her role is important because she represents the life Hutch is trying to protect, but the character does not receive as much development as some viewers might have wanted. There are hints of emotional distance between Hutch and his family, but the film is much more interested in his violent transformation than rebuilding those relationships. The same can be said for Michael Ironside's character. Having an actor with his presence is always a welcome addition, but the movie does not give him a huge amount to work with. Still, the supporting cast does exactly what this kind of action movie needs. They create contrast. They make Hutch's world feel bigger. They add humor, history, and unexpected moments that keep the film from becoming just another series of fights. And ultimately, that is where the casting succeeds. The movie's biggest strength is still Bob Odenkirk, but performances like Christopher Lloyd's prove that nobody understands something important about this genre. Sometimes the most memorable moments come from the characters you never expected to matter. The moment people heard that Nobody was written by Derek Kolstad, comparisons to John Wick were basically unavoidable. And honestly, the movie itself almost invites that comparison. Both films are built around a similar idea. A person with a violent past tries to leave that life behind. Something pushes them too far, and suddenly the world remembers exactly who they are. In John Wick, that trigger sends a legendary assassin back into action. In Nobody, the idea is slightly different. Hutch Mansell is not introduced as someone who already looks dangerous. He is the guy nobody notices. The person people underestimate, and that difference is where the movie finds its identity. The structure is familiar, there is no denying that. You have the criminal organization, the escalating revenge story, the waves of enemies, and the hero moving deeper into a world he tried to escape. It follows a formula that modern action audiences know very well, but the interesting choice is putting Bob Odenkirk at the center of that formula. A character like this played by a traditional action star would probably feel much more predictable. You would immediately understand what you were watching, but because Hutch looks like an average working man, the movie creates a different kind of curiosity. You are not waiting to see if he can fight. You are waiting to see why he can fight. That mystery gives Nobody its own flavor. At the same time, the similarities to John Wick are impossible to ignore. The choreography, the style of violence, the criminal world, and even the idea of a dangerous man being pulled back into action all feel connected. Some viewers will see that as a natural evolution of the genre. Others might feel like the movie is standing too close to something that already did it better. Both arguments are fair. The thing that saves Nobody from feeling like a simple copy is that it has a different personality. John Wick is built around coolness, precision, and mythology. Hutch is a much messier character. He is older, more frustrated, and less polished. He does not move through the world like a legend. He looks like a guy who has spent years trying to hide the fact that he is capable of violence. That makes the fantasy slightly different. There's also a connection to older revenge movies, where ordinary people are pushed until they finally break. The appeal comes from that very human frustration, the idea of someone constantly being ignored, disrespected, or underestimated, and eventually deciding they have had enough. Of course, the movie takes that idea to an extreme. Real life does not work this way. Most people do not have a secret history as highly trained operatives waiting to be activated. But action movies have always been built around exaggerating those feelings. That is the fantasy. Nobody understands that it is not selling realism. It is selling the satisfaction of watching someone who has been overlooked finally reveal what he is capable of. So yes, the John Wick influence is obvious. Sometimes it feels almost too obvious. But the movie's biggest advantage is that it takes that familiar framework and places an unexpected actor inside it. And sometimes a familiar story can still be enjoyable when the person telling it brings something new to the table. In this case, that something is Bob Odenkirk turning a well-worn action formula into something surprisingly personal. One of the reasons Nobody works better than its simple premise might suggest is the way director Ilya Naishuller presents the material. The story itself is familiar, but the filmmaking gives it enough energy and style to keep things moving. What stands out immediately is the contrast between the quiet opening and the chaos that follows. The beginning of the movie is deliberately slow. Instead of rushing into action, Naishuller spends time showing Hutch's repetitive life. The same routines, the same locations, the same feeling that every day blends into the next. It is not flashy filmmaking, but it serves an important purpose. You need to understand how trapped Hutch feels before the movie lets him break free. The editing plays a big role here. Those early sequences of daily repetition are cut together in a way that makes Hutch's life feel almost mechanical. It creates this sense that he is stuck on autopilot. The film is showing you that the problem is not just that Hutch is bored, it is that he has slowly disappeared into a life where nobody really sees him anymore. Then, when the violence begins, the visual style changes with him. The action scenes are where Naishuller really shows his strengths. The camera stays focused on the movement, allowing the audience to follow the choreography instead of hiding behind fast cuts and chaotic editing. You can understand where characters are, what is happening, and how much impact each hit has. That sounds simple, but a lot of action movies struggle with it. The film has a clean visual approach. Even during the most violent moments, there is a sense of control. The fights feel carefully designed rather than randomly thrown together. The camera captures the physicality of the action while still maintaining the exaggerated style the movie is going for. At the same time, Nobody is not trying to be a realistic crime drama. As the movie progresses, the visual presentation moves further into comic book territory. The situations become bigger, the action becomes more extreme, and the film starts embracing its own absurdity. That shift will work differently depending on the viewer. Some people will enjoy how confidently the movie goes all in. Others may feel that the grounded atmosphere from the beginning gets replaced by something much more familiar and exaggerated by the final act. The cinematography helps bridge those two sides. The movie can move from quiet family scenes to explosive action without feeling like two completely separate projects. There is a consistent sense of style throughout, even when the tone becomes more extreme. Naishuller also understands the importance of timing. The movie does not overload you with action from the first minute. It builds anticipation, allowing the tension to grow before releasing it. That makes the bigger sequences feel more satisfying because they come after you have spent time wondering what Hutch is really capable of. Is it the most original visual style in the action genre? Probably not. The film clearly belongs to a world influenced by modern gun-fu and revenge thrillers, but it does have confidence. Nobody knows exactly what kind of experience it wants to deliver, and Naishuller directs it with enough energy and control to make a familiar story feel entertaining. The movie may not reinvent action filmmaking, but it understands how to frame violence, build momentum, and make a simple premise feel much bigger than it actually is. One of the more interesting things about Nobody is that it is constantly balancing between different types of movies. At times, it feels like a grounded story about a frustrated man dealing with his own failures. Then, a few scenes later, it turns into an exaggerated action spectacle where an elderly man is joining a shootout and the body count starts climbing. And somehow, most of the time, it works. The movie's sense of humor comes from that contrast. The funniest moments are often created by putting ordinary situations next to completely ridiculous levels of violence. Hutch looks like the kind of person who would apologize if someone bumped into him on the street, so watching him suddenly become extremely dangerous creates an unusual kind of comedy. But what is important is that the movie never treats Hutch like a joke. That could have been the biggest mistake. The entire concept sounds like something that could easily become a parody. The normal guy becomes an action hero. But Bob Odenkirk plays Hutch with complete seriousness, and the film follows his emotional journey instead of simply laughing at the idea. The humor comes from the situation, not from making Hutch look foolish. There is also a surprising amount of frustration and sadness underneath the action. Before Hutch starts fighting, the movie spends time showing how invisible he feels. He is not just angry because someone broke into his house. He is angry because he has spent years feeling like he no longer matters. That emotional foundation gives the violence a little more weight. Of course, the movie is still a fantasy. It takes those everyday feelings of being ignored, underestimated, or pushed around and turns them into an extreme revenge story. Most people are not secretly trained fighters waiting for their moment, but that is exactly why these movies work. They exaggerate emotions that audiences recognize. The idea is not realistic. The feeling behind it is. The film's tone becomes much more exaggerated as it moves forward. The early sections feel closer to a character drama, while the later action scenes fully embrace a comic book style. Some viewers will love that shift because it allows the movie to become bigger and more entertaining. Others might feel that the balance starts to slip. There are moments where the movie almost feels like two different experiences. One side wants to explore Hutch as a damaged person trying to control himself. The other side wants to celebrate him becoming an unstoppable force. The transition between those ideas is not always perfect. But the strange mixture is also part of what makes Nobody memorable. The film understands that action does not always have to be completely serious. Sometimes the most entertaining moments come from the collision between the ridiculous and the intense. A brutal fight can happen, and a few seconds later, the movie can make you laugh at how absurd the situation has become. That combination of violence, humor, and emotion is what gives Nobody its personality. It is not trying to be a deep psychological study, and it is not just empty action either. Somewhere in between those two extremes is where the movie finds its charm, a story about a man losing control, told with enough humor to keep it fun and enough emotion to make you care about why he loses it in the first place. A big part of why Nobody is such an enjoyable watch is that the movie understands the importance of energy. It is not just about what is happening on screen, it is about how the film makes those moments feel. And a huge part of that comes from the soundtrack. The music gives the movie a personality that goes beyond the basic action formula. A lot of action films can start to blend together because the structure is so familiar. You know the hero will be pushed too far, you know the enemies will keep coming, and you know things will eventually explode into a massive final confrontation. What helps Nobody stand out is the way it uses music to make those familiar moments feel fresh and entertaining. The soundtrack often creates an interesting contrast with what is happening visually. You might have a scene filled with chaos and violence, but the music choice adds a strange sense of fun or irony. That contrast fits the movie perfectly because Nobody has always been built around the idea of mixing ordinary life with extreme situations. The film takes a regular-looking guy and places him in completely outrageous circumstances, and the music helps sell that transformation. There's also a strong rhythm to the movie because of how the soundtrack works with the action. The songs are not just background noise. They help control the mood of important scenes, making certain moments feel more intense, more unexpected, or even more humorous. That matters because Nobody is not a film that depends only on story. The entertainment comes from the entire package, the performances, the fights, the pacing, and the overall attitude. And in that sense, the movie knows exactly what it wants to be. It is a compact action ride. It does not spend hours building complicated mythology or slowing down to explain every detail. It moves quickly, delivers the big moments, and gets out before the formula starts becoming tiring. That shorter runtime works in its favor. The movie feels like it is constantly moving forward. Even when the story is familiar, the pacing keeps things lively enough that you are rarely waiting for something interesting to happen. Of course, whether you enjoy that depends on what you are looking for. If you want a detailed, realistic thriller with complex storytelling, the movie may feel too simple. But if you want an energetic action film with style, humor, and a great sense of momentum, Nobody understands exactly how to deliver that experience. The soundtrack, the action, and the overall presentation all work together toward the same goal, making the audience have a good time. And sometimes that is exactly what an action movie needs to do. It does not have to reinvent the genre. It just has to understand its own identity and deliver the kind of entertainment it promises. Nobody succeeds because it knows when to be serious, when to be ridiculous, and when to simply let the chaos take over. The music is a big part of that attitude. It gives the movie the extra bit of confidence that turns a familiar action story into a much more enjoyable ride. One of the things you have to understand about Nobody is that it is not really trying to be realistic. The movie borrows the appearance of a grounded thriller, but underneath that, it is built around a fantasy that audiences have been enjoying for decades. The fantasy of being underestimated. Hutch Mansell is the kind of person most people would ignore. He is not the loudest person in the room. He does not look intimidating. He does not demand attention. And that is exactly why the idea of him suddenly revealing a completely different side is so satisfying. There is something very familiar about that wish fulfillment idea. The person who gets overlooked, ignored, or disrespected finally gets the chance to prove everyone wrong. It is a feeling that a lot of revenge movies are built around because, on some level, audiences understand the frustration behind it. Everyone knows what it feels like to be underestimated. Of course, nobody takes that emotion and pushes it to an extreme. In reality, someone having a bad day at work or feeling invisible in their own life does not suddenly turn into a highly trained fighter with a hidden history. The movie is not asking you to believe that. It is asking you to enjoy the fantasy. And once you accept that, the film becomes much easier to appreciate. The problem is that this kind of fantasy can also create uncomfortable questions. Hutch's actions are not always simple or morally clean. The movie wants you to support him because he is protecting his family and fighting dangerous people, but it also spends a lot of time showing how much he enjoys returning to that violent side of himself. That contradiction is actually one of the more interesting parts of the character. Is Hutch becoming the person he was trying to escape from, or is he finally accepting a part of himself that was always there? The movie does not spend too much time exploring those questions, but they exist underneath all the explosions and fight scenes. Some viewers will find that complexity interesting. Others may feel the movie is just using a familiar revenge fantasy without examining the consequences. And that is where Nobody will probably divide audiences. If you approach it expecting realism, the movie is going to feel ridiculous. The number of enemies Hutch defeats, the situations he survives, and the escalation of violence all belong firmly in action movie territory. But if you approach it as a stylized fantasy, it becomes much more enjoyable. The appeal is not that Hutch is believable in every situation. The appeal is watching someone who seems powerless discover that he was never powerless at all. That idea has always been the engine behind this type of story. Whether it is a retired fighter, a secret agent, or just an ordinary person pushed too far, audiences enjoy seeing hidden strength come to the surface. Nobody simply puts its own spin on that idea by making the person revealing that hidden side someone you would never expect. And honestly, that is where the movie finds its charm. It is not realistic, and it does not need to be. It is a heightened action fantasy built around a very human feeling, the desire to be seen, respected, and underestimated no longer. After everything Nobody throws at you, the biggest question is pretty simple. Does the movie actually work, or is it just another familiar action film dressed up with a different face? The answer is a little complicated. Because on one hand, Nobody is built on a formula we have seen many times before. The hidden past, the ordinary person with extraordinary skills, the criminal organization that underestimates the wrong guy. The escalating revenge story that eventually leads to a massive final confrontation. None of that is completely new, but what makes the movie enjoyable is that it understands how to make familiar ingredients entertaining. The biggest strength, without question, is Bob Odenkirk. The entire concept depends on the audience believing Hutch Mansell, and Odenkirk sells that transformation surprisingly well. He makes the quiet, overlooked version of Hutch believable, but he also convinces you that there is something dangerous underneath. Without that performance, the whole movie could have fallen apart. The action is another major strength. The fights are creative, physical, and easy to follow. The movie understands that good action is not just about making things louder. It is about making the audience feel every hit, every struggle, and every decision. Even when the situations become ridiculous, the choreography keeps the movie engaging. The supporting cast also adds a lot, especially Christopher Lloyd, who brings a completely unexpected energy to the film. His involvement gives the movie some of its most memorable moments and adds to the strange charm of the whole experience. The humor is another thing that helps Nobody stand out. The movie knows it is playing with a familiar genre, and it has fun with that. It can be violent one second and surprisingly funny the next. That balance keeps the film from feeling like a completely serious revenge thriller. But the movie definitely has weaknesses. The biggest one is originality. If you have watched a lot of modern action movies, especially films influenced by the John Wick style, you will recognize many of the ideas here. The structure, the villains, and the overall progression are all familiar territory. Some viewers will see that as a problem. They may feel like Nobody is borrowing too heavily from movies that came before it. The story itself is also fairly simple. Outside of Hutch, many characters do not receive a huge amount of development. The villains mostly exist to create obstacles, and certain plot points happen mainly because the movie needs to move toward the next action sequence. The tone can also be uneven. The beginning feels more grounded, focusing on Hutch's frustration and family life. But by the final act, the movie has fully embraced a much more exaggerated, almost comic book style. For some people, that escalation is exactly what makes it fun. For others, it may feel like the movie loses some of the tension it built earlier, and that probably explains the different reactions to Nobody. If you want a completely fresh action experience with a deeply original story, this movie may disappoint you. But if you are looking for an energetic, stylish, and entertaining action film with a great lead performance, it delivers exactly what it promises. In the end, Nobody succeeds because it knows what it is. It is not trying to be the next revolutionary action masterpiece. It is a compact, violent, funny, and surprisingly charming ride built around one great idea. What happens when the person everyone ignores finally decides he is done being ignored? And thanks to Bob Odenkirk's performance, that simple idea is enough to carry the entire movie.